Welcome back to Sleep Talk, where we dive deep into gaming's greatest stories. Ever wondered what happens when gods fall and heroes rise from the ashes? Today, we journey into the dark fantasy realm of Lords of the Fallen to explore one of the most compelling tales of redemption, divine corruption, and the eternal struggle between order and chaos. Over the next couple hours, we'll uncover the complete narrative spanning both the original 2014 game and its 2023 reboot, examining the rise and fall of gods, the price of divine power, and the cyclical nature of tyranny and rebellion. Please note that while we'll focus on the factual lore and established narrative elements, some of our discussion will include thematic interpretation and analysis of the deeper meanings behind these stories. We'll make it clear when we're moving from established fact to interpretive analysis. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin this epic adventure together into the world of Mournstead and beyond. What if the darkness you fight becomes a part of you? Chapter 1. The Ancient Tyranny. In the beginning, there was darkness. Not the comforting darkness of night, but the oppressive shadow of absolute tyranny. Long before humanity knew freedom, before the concept of redemption existed, the world lay under this iron grip of Adyr, a demon god whose very name would become synonymous with cruelty and despair. Adyr was no ordinary deity. He was a being of immense power who commanded legions of demonic creatures known as the Rogur. These beings, twisted manifestations of his dark will, served as both his army and the instrument of his dominion over the mortal realm. For eons, Adyr ruled with unprecedented cruelty, whipping humanity into a religious frenzy that saw countless souls put to death for perceived sins, real or imagined. The world during Adyr's reign was a place where hope itself was considered heresy. The demon god demanded absolute submission, and those who dared to question his authority faced fates worse than death. His influence corrupted not just the physical realm, but the very souls of those who lived under his shadow. The Rogur, his demonic servants, spread across the land like a plague, enforcing his will with ruthless efficiency. But even in the darkest times, the human spirit refuses to be completely extinguished. Despite the overwhelming power of Adyr and his demonic legions, small pockets of resistance began to form. These were not the grand armies of legend, but ordinary people who had witnessed too much suffering, who had lost too much to remain silent any longer. The nature of Adyr's tyranny was particularly insidious because it masqueraded as divine order. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a rightful ruler whose authority came from his very nature as a god. This made resistance not just dangerous, but spiritually complex. To oppose Adyr was to oppose the divine order itself, at least as it was understood by those who lived under his rule. The Rogur blight, a manifestation of Adyr's dark power, spread corruption wherever it took hold. This wasn't merely a physical phenomenon, but a spiritual one. Areas affected by the blight became twisted and deformed with vegetation dying, and the landscape taking on a sickly, unnatural appearance. More terrifyingly, humans exposed to the blight for prolonged periods would suffer severe physical and mental corruption, eventually transforming into monstrous beings that served Adyr's will. This corruption was perhaps the most insidious aspect of Adyr's power. It meant that merely existing in his world was gradually eroding one's humanity. The very act of survival under his rule came with the risk of losing everything that made one human. It was a system designed to crush not just bodies but souls. Yet even as the blight spread and the Rogur enforced their master's will, whispers of rebellion grew, small acts of defiance, barely perceptible moments of resistance began to accumulate. It would take a miracle, or perhaps 3 of them, to break the chains that bound humanity to this dark god's will. Chapter 2. The 3 Heroes and the Chainers. From the depths of despair, legends are born. The turning point in humanity's struggle. Against Adyr came from what the historical records describe as 3 heroes, a warrior, a rogue, and a cleric. These 3 individuals would later become known as the Judges, though the full details of how their victory was achieved have been clarified by later events. According to the lore revealed in the 2023 events, these heroes were part of or connected to a group known as the Chainers, powerful beings who served under Aureus, the Radiance god. The most significant of these was the cleric, who would later be known as Judge Cleric, or by her original name, Eel. What makes Eel's story particularly complex is that she had originally been a warrior, priestess serving Adyr himself, before betraying him to join the cause of his defeat. This betrayal provided crucial insider knowledge that would prove instrumental in the war against the demon god. The Chainers, led by followers of Aureus, understood that Adyr's power was built on fear and absolute dominion, where traditional resistance had failed. They developed new strategies that combined divine power with human determination. Their approach was not merely to fight Adyr with conventional weapons, but to challenge the very foundations of his rule. Eel's role was particularly crucial because she brought insider knowledge of Adyr's weaknesses and the nature of his power. Her betrayal was not just a political act, but a spiritual transformation that represented the possibility of redemption, even for those who had served the forces of darkness. Together, the Chainers began what would later be remembered as the War of Liberation. It was not a war fought with traditional armies, though battles were certainly part of it. Instead, it was a war for the very soul of humanity, a struggle to prove that divine power could be turned toward liberation rather than oppression. The details of this war have been obscured by time and the differences between historical accounts. What we know from the established lore is that these 3 heroes, working with or as part of the Chainers under Aureus guidance, somehow managed to accomplish what had seemed impossible. They defeated a god, but this victory came at a cost that would echo through the centuries that followed. Adyr could not be killed. Despite their power and determination, the heroes discovered that a god, even a dark one, could not simply be destroyed. Instead, they were forced to bind him, to seal him away in a prison of their own making. This required immense magical power, the kind that would leave its own mark on the world. The binding of Adyr was accomplished through the creation of powerful magical beacons, towers that would serve as both markers and guardians of the demon god's prison. 5 beacons were constructed, each one a magnificent work of magical engineering designed to contain a portion of Adyr's power and prevent his return. But the cost of this victory was higher than anyone could have anticipated. According to the established lore, the immense magical energies required to bind a god caused a terrible plague to spread from the place of Adyr's defeat. This plague, a corrupting remnant of the demon god's influence, became known as the Roger Blight. The heroes who had sacrificed everything to free humanity from Adyr's tyranny found themselves infected with the very corruption they had fought to eliminate. They began to decay and corrupt over time, and were elevated to the status of judges, becoming the new rulers of humanity. This corruption would prove to be one of history's great recurring themes. In their efforts to save humanity from divine tyranny, the heroes had inadvertently set the stage for a new form of oppression, one that would be all the more insidious because it wore the mask of liberation. The victory over Adyr marked the end of one age and the beginning of another, but it also established a pattern that would repeat throughout the history of this world: the corruption of power, the inevitable decay of even the most noble intentions, and the cyclical nature of tyranny and rebellion. The elevation of the Chainers to the status of judges would create a new ruling class that over time would develop its own forms of oppression and control. Chapter 3. The Age of the Judges. In the immediate aftermath of Adyr's defeat, humanity experienced something it had never known: freedom from divine tyranny. The 3 heroes who had accomplished this seemingly impossible feat were elevated to the status of demigods and given the title of judges. According to the established lore, a new society emerged that was initially based on the principle of eliminating sin and creating human perfection. The new society that emerged under the judges' rule was built on the principle of marking and punishing all transgressions. The system of punishment established by the judges involved marking criminals with tattoos that permanently identified their crimes. These tattoos etched into the face and body served as a constant reminder of one's sins and a warning to others. No sin was forgotten, no transgression overlooked. This system created a hierarchy of suffering within society. Those with the most tattoos were considered the most dangerous, the most corrupted, the least worthy of redemption. They were imprisoned, ostracized, and treated as living examples of what humanity must not become. But the greatest irony of this system was that the judges themselves were slowly succumbing to the very corruption they sought to eliminate. The Roger blight, the lingering influence of Adyr's power, had infected them during their battle with the demon god. This corruption was subtle at first, but it grew stronger with each passing year, and it would eventually spread to affect the entire structure of their rule. As the judges decayed, their rule became increasingly harsh and arbitrary. What had begun as a noble effort to create a perfect society gradually transformed into a new form of tyranny, one that was perhaps more insidious than Adyr's because it claimed to be righteous. The corruption manifested in different ways for each of the three judges. Some became obsessed with order to the point of crushing any form of creativity or individual expression. Others developed an insatiable hunger for power, using their divine status to manipulate and control those beneath them. Still others became paranoid, seeing enemies and threats everywhere, responding to imagined slights with disproportionate violence. This corruption spread beyond the judges themselves. The place where Adyr had been defeated became a source of ongoing contamination with the Roger, blight seeping into the surrounding areas. Many of those who lived near this site became twisted versions of their former selves, susceptible to dark influences and prone to violence. Some of these corrupted individuals were transformed into demonic beasts similar to the original. Roger. These new Roger served as a constant reminder of Adyr's looming presence and the fragility of the order the judges had established. As the years passed, it became increasingly difficult to distinguish between the rule of the judges and the tyranny of Adyr they had replaced. The same arbitrary punishments, the same atmosphere of fear, the same crushing of individual spirit that had characterized the demon god's reign now existed under the supposedly enlightened rule of the three heroes. Yet, the populace continued to worship the judges, partly out of genuine belief, partly out of fear, and partly because they could not imagine any alternative. The judges had become the only gods they knew, and the idea of opposing them seemed not just dangerous, but blasphemous. This was the world into which our story's protagonist would eventually emerge. A world where the heroes had become the villains, where salvation had transformed into a new form of damnation, and where the very concept of redemption had been corrupted by those who claimed to offer it. But even in this dark age, the pattern established by the original three heroes would repeat. Where there is tyranny, there will always be those who resist. And sometimes the most unlikely people become the instruments of liberation. Chapter 4. The Most Tattooed Man. 8,000 years after the defeat of Adyr, the world had settled into a grim routine under the rule of the judges. According to the established lore, their corruption was now complete. Their tyranny as absolute as that of the demon god they had once defeated. It was into this world that Harkin was born, a man destined to become the most tattooed criminal in the land. The exact nature of Harkin's crimes remains deliberately mysterious in the source material. What we know from the games is that his face and body are covered with tattoos representing his various transgressions. marking him as someone who refused to live by the rules established by the judges' society. Each tattoo tells a story of defiance, marking him as a man who looked at the supposedly perfect society created by the judges and found it wanting. The sheer number of these marks suggests not just a criminal, but someone whose very existence challenged the foundation of the world around him. In a society obsessed with perfection and order, Harkin represented chaos personified. He was living proof that the judges' system had failed, that despite centuries of effort to eliminate sin and imperfection, the human spirit remained unbroken. His crimes were not just transgressions against law, but acts of rebellion against a system that sought to control every aspect of human behavior. One of the tattoos on Harkin's face spells out a DYRQAMAR, suggesting that among his many crimes was blasphemy. Specifically, the rejection of the religious order established by the judges. This was considered one of the most serious offenses possible, as it struck at the very heart of the judges' authority. The world Harkin inhabited was one where no sin was ever forgotten. Unlike modern justice systems focused on rehabilitation, the society of the judges was built on permanent punishment and eternal shame. The tattoos served as a constant reminder, not just to the criminal, but to everyone around them of past transgressions. This created a class of permanent outcasts, people who could never fully rejoin society, regardless of their attempts at redemption. Harkin belonged to this class, a man whose face proclaimed his unworthiness to all who looked upon him. Yet paradoxically, it would be this very unworthiness that would qualify him for the most important mission in human history. The irony was not lost on those who understood the deeper patterns at work. Just as the three original heroes had been unlikely saviors, drawn from different walks of life, but united in their opposition to tyranny, so too would salvation come from the most unexpected source. A convicted criminal whose sins were written on his face for all to see. Harkin's imprisonment was not just a punishment, but a test of endurance. He had been forced to confront the consequences of his actions every day, to live with a constant reminder of his failures, carved into his very flesh. This experience had either broken him or forged him into something stronger. Time would tell which. The monk Castlow's decision to release Harkin was not made lightly. In a world where order was valued above all else, freeing the most dangerous criminal in existence was an act of desperation. It suggested that the threat they faced was so great that conventional solutions had failed. Cast himself represented an interesting contradiction within the religious order. As a monk, he was supposedly dedicated to the worship of the judges and the maintenance of their perfect society. Yet his willingness to free Harkin suggested that he understood something others did not, that sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely sources. The timing of Harkin's release was crucial. 8,000 years after Adyr's defeat, the demon god had somehow managed to return from his prison. His demonic forces, the Rogur, were once again invading the human realm, threatening to undo everything the judges had built. This return was not just a military threat, but an existential one. If Adyr succeeded in reclaiming his power, humanity would once again be plunged into the dark age of absolute tyranny that their ancestors had fought so hard to escape. All the sacrifices, all the corruption, all the suffering of the past 8 millennia would be rendered meaningless. Yet, there was a deeper irony at work. The society created by the judges had become so rigid, so obsessed with order and perfection, that it had lost the very qualities that had originally enabled humanity to resist divine tyranny. Creativity, independent thinking, and moral flexibility had all been branded as dangerous imperfections to be eliminated. Harkin, with his multitude of sins and his refusal to conform, represented everything the judges claimed to oppose. Yet he also embodied the qualities that humanity would need to once again face down a god. The willingness to break rules, to think independently, to sacrifice everything for a principle. The decision to entrust humanity's salvation to its greatest sinner was either the height of desperation or the deepest wisdom. Perhaps it was both. Chapter 5. The Return of the Ancient Evil. The monastery near the Hand of God Mountains was supposed to be a place of peace and contemplation, a sanctuary where the faithful could worship the judges in tranquility. Instead, it became ground zero for humanity's greatest crisis in 8 millennia, the return of Adyr and his demonic legions. The signs had been building for some time, though few recognized them for what they were. The 5 beacons of Sentinels, those magnificent towers that had contained Adyr's power for so long, had begun to show signs of corruption. Their pure light flickered and dimmed, tainted by the very evil they were meant to contain. The Roger blight, that persistent corruption left over from Adyr's original defeat, had never truly been eliminated. It had lingered in the shadows, growing stronger with each passing year, fed by the very corruption that had infected the judges themselves. Now it erupted forth with renewed vigor, transforming peaceful landscapes into hellscapes of twisted metal and corrupted flesh. But it was not just the return of an old enemy that made this crisis so dangerous. Adyr had learned from his previous defeat. He understood now that humanity could not be conquered through brute force alone. Instead, he had developed a more subtle approach, one that exploited the very weaknesses that the judges' society had created. The Roger that emerged from the dimensional rifts were not the same demons that had been defeated 8,000 years before. These new creatures were adapted specifically to fight against the ordered society that humanity had built. They struck not just at military targets, but at the psychological foundations of human civilization. They targeted the symbols of order and perfection that the judges had erected, demonstrating that all of humanity's attempts at creating a perfect society were ultimately futile. They corrupted the very institutions that were meant to protect against corruption, turning the judge's own system against itself. The monastery's fall was particularly symbolic. This was a place dedicated to the worship of the 3 heroes who had originally defeated Adyr. Yet, it could not protect itself against the demon god's return. The invasion of the monastery represented the failure of the old order, the inadequacy of the judges' system to deal with the threat they had originally been created to contain. Harkin's arrival at the monastery with Koslow was perfectly timed, though whether by design or cosmic irony remained unclear. Here was the most tattooed criminal in the land arriving at the holiest site in the human realm, just as it was falling to demonic invasion. The symbolism was unmistakable. Salvation would not come from the pure and perfect, but from the fallen and corrupted. The Roger lords that Harkin encountered were not ordinary demons, but powerful beings that had been specifically crafted by Adyr to lead his new invasion. Each one represented a different aspect of the demon god's power and a different challenge for humanity to overcome. These lords were not just military commanders, but symbols of everything that Adyr represented. They embodied chaos, corruption, and the rejection of the ordered society that humanity had tried to build. Fighting them was not just a matter of martial skill, but a test of one's commitment to the values that made humanity worth saving. The invasion also revealed the extent to which the judges' society had become complacent. 8,000 years of relative peace had led to a decline in military readiness and a loss of the survival instincts that had originally enabled humanity to resist divine tyranny. The current generation had never faced a real existential threat, and they were ill-prepared for the horror that Adyr represented. But the invasion also revealed something else. The corruption within the judges themselves had progressed further than anyone had realized. As we would later discover, some of those who were supposed to be leading humanity's defense had their own agenda, one that was not necessarily aligned with humanity's survival. The discovery of the pathway, the portal to the Roger realm, was a crucial turning point in the crisis. This was not just a means for the demons to enter the human world, but a former temple of Adyr that had been banished to another dimension by the original judges. Its reappearance suggested that the barriers between dimensions were breaking down, that the cosmic order established 8,000 years ago was finally failing. Harkin's decision to enter the Rogur realm was an act of either incredible courage or suicidal desperation. This was the heart of enemy territory, a dimension shaped by Adyr's will and populated by his most loyal servants. For a human to enter this realm was to risk not just death, but corruption of the soul itself. Yet it was precisely this willingness to enter hell itself that marked Harkin as a true hero. Like the three original judges, he was prepared to sacrifice everything, including his own humanity, if necessary to save others from tyranny. The crafter that Harkin encountered in the Rogur realm represented yet another layer of complexity in this ancient conflict. Here was an immortal being whose crystal of travels had been stolen by the Rogur, suggesting that Adyr's corruption extended beyond the human realm into the cosmic order itself. The alliance between Harkin and the crafter was born of necessity rather than trust. Both had been wronged by Adyr and his servants, and both had something to gain from the demon god's defeat. Yet this alliance also foreshadowed the moral ambiguity that would characterize much of Harkin's journey. Stopping the initial invasion by recovering the Crystal of Travels was only the first step in a much larger conflict. It bought humanity time, but it did not address the underlying problem. Adyr himself was still alive, still imprisoned, but growing stronger, and still determined to reclaim his dominion over the mortal realm. The temporary victory also revealed the extent to which humanity's leaders had been compromised. Antanes, the supposed leader of human forces, would soon reveal his own agenda, one that was far more complex and morally ambiguous than simple resistance to demonic invasion. Chapter 6. The Chamber of Lies. Deep within the Rogur realm lay a place that embodied everything twisted about Adyr's domain, the Chamber of Lies. This was not merely a location, but a concept made manifest. A place where truth itself was corrupted and reality meant to serve the demon god's will. Harkin's journey to this chamber was fraught with both physical and psychological dangers. The Rogur realm was not just hostile to human life, but hostile to human sanity. Every step deeper into this dimension brought with it the risk of losing oneself to the same corruption that had claimed so many others. The Chamber of Lies served multiple purposes in Adyr's grand design. It was a prison for those who dared to speak truth in a realm built on deception. It was a testing ground where the demon god could examine the moral character of his enemies. And it was a place of revelation where carefully hidden truths could finally be exposed. It was here that Harkin encountered one of the most morally complex decisions of his journey. Yetka, the explorer who had helped him discover the pathway, revealed that there was a demon in the chamber linked to her family. This was not just any demon, but one whose fate would have profound implications for everyone involved. The choice presented to Harkin was deceptively simple: kill the demon or allow Yetka to leave with it. But like all meaningful choices in this world, the decision carried implications far beyond its immediate consequences. This was a test of mercy versus justice, of personal loyalty versus abstract principle. The demon in question was not a mindless monster, but a being with its own history and connections to the mortal realm. Its existence challenged the simple narrative of demons as pure evil and humans as innocent victims. The reality, as always in this world, was far more complex. Yetka's connection to this demon suggested that the boundaries between human and demon, between good and evil, were not as clear-cut as the judge's society would have its citizens believe. This was a theme that would run throughout Harkin's journey. The recognition that moral complexity exists, even in the most seemingly straightforward situations. The chamber itself seemed to respond to the choices made within it. The very architecture of the place shifted and changed based on the moral decisions of those who entered, creating a physical manifestation of the consequences of one's actions. This was Adyr's power at its most insidious, the ability to make environment itself a reflection of moral corruption. But the Chamber of Lies also served another purpose. It was a place where the truth about humanity's current leadership could finally be revealed. The evidence that Harkin discovered here would prove that the corruption within human society ran far deeper than anyone had imagined. The revelation that Antonis was conducting experiments on monks, transforming them into mutants capable of fighting the Rogur, represented a fundamental betrayal of everything the judges claimed to stand for. Here was a leader who was supposed to be protecting humanity, instead treating human beings as expendable resources in his quest for power. These experiments were not just morally reprehensible, but practically counterproductive. By transforming humans into monsters, Antonis was essentially doing Adyr's work for him. He was proving the demon god's central thesis that humanity was inherently corruptible and therefore deserved to be ruled by a superior power. The discovery of these experiments also revealed the extent to which the current leadership had lost sight of what they were supposed to be fighting for. In their obsession with victory at any cost, they had become indistinguishable from the enemy they claimed to oppose. This corruption was not accidental, but the inevitable result of a system that prioritized order over morality, victory over virtue. The judges' society had created the conditions for its own moral decay by emphasizing conformity and obedience over individual conscience and moral reasoning. The irony was that in trying to create a perfect society, the judges had created one that was perfectly vulnerable to the kind of corruption that Adyr represented. By eliminating the very qualities that made humanity resilient, creativity, independence, moral flexibility, they had made their society brittle and prone to catastrophic failure. Harkin's response to these revelations would define not just his character, but the future of humanity itself. Would he choose to work within the corrupted system, trying to reform it from within? Would he reject both Adyr and the judges seeking a third path? Or would he embrace the corruption, accepting that moral compromise was the price of survival? The Chamber of Lies forced these questions to the surface, demanding answers that could not be avoided or postponed. It was a place where the convenient lies that people told themselves were stripped away, leaving only the harsh reality of moral choice. But perhaps the greatest lie revealed in the chamber was the one that humanity had been telling itself for 8,000 years, that the defeat of Adyr had truly represented a victory for good over evil. The truth was far more complex and far more disturbing. Chapter 7. The Final Revelation. When Harkin finally came face to face with Adyr himself, the encounter did not unfold as anyone might have expected. The demon god did not immediately attack or attempt to corrupt his opponent. Instead, he offered something far more dangerous: the truth. Adyr's revelation was devastating in its simplicity and logic. Humanity, he argued, needed a god to preserve order. Without divine guidance, mortals inevitably descended into chaos, corruption, and self-destruction. The evidence for this claim was overwhelming, and it was standing right there in the chamber with them. The demon god showed Harkin visions of Antonis transforming himself into a hideous monster, consuming a potion that would grant him power at the cost of his humanity. This was not just an example of individual corruption, but a symbol of humanity's fundamental inability to govern itself without divine oversight. The transformation of Antonis was particularly significant because it demonstrated that even those who claimed to be fighting against corruption were themselves susceptible to it. The leader of humanity's resistance had become exactly the kind of monster that the resistance was supposed to be fighting against. But Adyr's argument went deeper than just pointing out individual failures. He claimed that the entire system created by the judges was flawed from its foundation. By trying to eliminate evil without providing proper guidance, they had created a vacuum that would inevitably be filled by corruption. The demon god presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a necessary ruler whose harsh methods were justified by the alternative. The chaos and self-destruction that humanity would inevitably choose if left to its own devices. From his perspective, tyranny was preferable to anarchy. This argument was made more compelling by the evidence that surrounded them. The judges themselves had become corrupt. Their society had created someone like Harkin, whose face was covered with tattoos representing his crimes. The system had clearly failed to achieve its stated goals of perfection and order. Adyr offered Harkin a choice, but it was not the simple choice between good and evil that might be expected in a traditional fantasy story. Instead, it was a choice between different forms of corruption, different types of necessary evil. The rune of Adyr that the demon god gave to Harkin was more than just a weapon or a tool. It was a symbol of the fundamental moral ambiguity that lay at the heart of this conflict. The rune could be used to restore Adyr's power, to destroy him, or to maintain the status quo with him imprisoned but alive. Each of these choices represented a different vision of what humanity's future should look like. Restoring Adyr would bring back the stability of absolute rule, but at the cost of freedom and individual dignity. Destroying him might preserve human autonomy, but at the risk of the chaos that had already begun to manifest. Keeping him imprisoned would maintain the current corrupt system, while avoiding the risks of either alternative. The weight of this choice was almost unbearable. Harkin, a convicted criminal whose own moral status was questionable, was being asked to make a decision that would affect the fate of all humanity. The irony was that someone society had deemed unworthy of redemption was now responsible for everyone's redemption. The conversation with Adyr also revealed the extent to which the lines between hero and villain had become blurred. The demon god spoke with the voice of experience and pragmatic wisdom, while the supposed heroes of humanity had revealed themselves to be corrupt and self-serving. This moral ambiguity was not accidental, but central to the story's deeper themes. In a world where the heroes had become villains, and the villains spoke uncomfortable truths, the simple narratives of good versus evil no longer applied. Adyr's offer was seductive precisely because it was logical. He was not asking Harkin to embrace evil, but to accept the necessity of harsh rule for the greater good of humanity. This was the same logic that had originally justified the judge's rule, and it was being used now to justify its replacement. The demon god's argument was strengthened by the fact that he was not lying about Antanas, or about the corruption within human society. Everything he claimed could be verified by Harkin's own observations. The truth of his diagnosis made his proposed solution seem more credible. But there was also a deeper question lurking beneath the surface of this encounter. Was Adyr truly evil? Or was he simply a harsh but necessary force for order in a chaotic universe? The story refused to provide easy answers to this question, forcing players to grapple with the moral complexity themselves. The scene with Adyr represented the climax of the game's intellectual conflict, the moment when all of the story's themes and questions came into sharp focus. It was not just a confrontation between a hero and a villain, but a philosophical debate about the nature of power, the necessity of order, and the price of freedom. Harkin's decision in this moment would define not just the ending of his story, but the beginning of a new chapter in humanity's long struggle with the question of how to live together without destroying each other. Chapter 8. The Price of Victory. Harkin's return from the Roger realm marked the beginning of the most difficult phase of his journey. Armed with knowledge of Antanas' corruption and carrying the rune of Adyr, he found himself in an impossible position. The very people he had been sent to protect now viewed him as a traitor. The logic of their suspicion was understandable, if tragic. Harkin had been sent to kill Adyr, but he had returned with the demon god's rune instead. To those who did not understand the full complexity of the situation, this looked like collaboration with the enemy. The monsters that confronted Harkin upon his return were not just physical obstacles, but symbols of the moral corruption that had infected humanity's leadership. These were the results of Antanas' experiments. Human beings transformed into weapons through scientific manipulation and ethical compromise. The discovery that Koslo, Harkin's mentor and the monk who had originally freed him, had been killed by Antanas was particularly devastating. This murder represented not just the loss of a valuable ally, but the complete breakdown of trust within humanity's leadership. Kaslo's death also served as a stark reminder of the price paid by those who tried to maintain their moral principles in a corrupted system. The monk had attempted to stop Antanas from transforming himself into a monster, and he had paid for that moral courage with his life. The final confrontation with Antanas was thus not just a battle between a hero and a villain, but a tragic confrontation between two different responses to an impossible situation. Both men had been forced to make terrible choices in the face of an existential threat to humanity. Antanas represented the path of utilitarian compromise, the willingness to sacrifice moral principles for practical results. His transformation into a monster was both literal and metaphorical, showing what happened to those who believed that the ends always justified the means. Harkin, despite his criminal past, represented a different path. The refusal to compromise core principles, even in the face of overwhelming pressure. His decision not to use the rune of Adyr to restore the demon god's power was a choice to accept uncertainty, rather than embrace a solution that required the sacrifice of human freedom. The battle itself was fierce and personal. This was not just combat between opponents, but a fight between former allies who had chosen different paths. Antanas fought with the strength of his monstrous transformation, while Harkin fought with the conviction of someone who had finally found something worth fighting for. The death of Antanas marked the end of one chapter in humanity's story, but it also raised new questions about what would come next. With both the corrupt human leadership and the demon god's immediate threat eliminated, humanity was faced with the challenge of rebuilding its civilization from the ground up. Harkin's choices in the aftermath of this victory would determine not just his own fate, but the future direction of human society. The rune of Adyr remained in his possession, a constant reminder that the power to reshape the world came with tremendous moral responsibility. The three possible endings to Harkin's story each represented a different vision of what humanity's future might look like. Using the rune in his weapon would revive Adyr, bringing back the stability of divine rule at the cost of freedom. Using it in his armor would destroy the demon god permanently, preserving human autonomy, but risking the chaos that might follow. Giving it to the crafter would maintain the status quo, keeping Adyr imprisoned while avoiding the risks of either extreme. Each choice carried its own moral weight and practical consequences. There was no perfect solution, no path that would eliminate all suffering and corruption. This was perhaps the story's most important lesson, that in a complex world, even heroes must accept imperfect solutions and live with the consequences of their choices. The aftermath of Harkin's victory was complicated by the fact that society was not prepared to accept him as a hero. His criminal past, marked permanently on his face with tattoos, made it impossible for him to assume a position of leadership or respectability. Instead of being celebrated, Harkin found himself branded as a traitor and forced to flee civilization. The same society that had benefited from his sacrifice was unable to forgive his past or accept that salvation had come from such an unlikely source. This rejection was both tragic and inevitable. The society created by the judges was built on the principle that criminals could never be truly redeemed, that the tattoos marking their sins were permanent reminders of their unworthiness. Even saving the world could not erase these marks or change society's perception of what they meant. Harkin's exile represented the final irony of his story. The man who had saved humanity from both divine tyranny and human corruption was unable to find a place in the world he had preserved. He was forced to wander alone, carrying the burden of the rune of Adyr and the knowledge of what he had sacrificed. But this exile also set the stage for the events that would unfold over the next 1,000 years. Harkin's possession of the rune meant that Adyr's influence would continue to affect the world, albeit in a different form. The demon god's power had not been eliminated, merely contained and channeled through a human vessel. Chapter 9. A 1,000-Year Exile. The centuries following Harkin's victory were marked by a gradual transformation of both the hero and the world he had saved. Carrying the rune of Adyr had consequences that became apparent only over time, as the artifact's power slowly worked changes in both its bearer and the world around him. Harkin's possession of an umbral lamp, a mysterious artifact that granted its bearer a form of immortality, ensured that he would live to see the long-term consequences of his choices. But immortality in this world was not a blessing. It was a burden that allowed one to witness the cyclical nature of human folly and divine corruption. As the years passed, Harkin watched as humanity struggled to rebuild its civilization in the aftermath of both Adyr's return and the collapse of the judge's corrupted order. New leaders emerged, new systems of government were established, and new forms of corruption inevitably took root. The pattern was always the same: initial hope and genuine reform, followed by gradual compromise and moral decay, leading eventually to the same kinds of tyranny and oppression that had characterized every previous age. The faces changed. The specific forms of corruption varied, but the underlying dynamics remained constant. During this long exile, Harkin came to understand something that perhaps only immortals can truly grasp: that the problems facing humanity were not aberrations to be solved, but permanent features of the human condition to be managed. The conflict between order and freedom, between individual desires and collective needs, between idealism and pragmatism. These were not temporary challenges, but eternal struggles. The rune of Adyr that he carried was both a reminder of this truth and a source of ongoing temptation. The demon god's power was still contained within the artifact, still offering the same seductive promise it had made in the Rogur realm. That tyranny was preferable to chaos. That harsh but effective rule was better than well-intentioned but ineffective freedom. As the centuries passed, this temptation grew stronger rather than weaker. Watching generation after generation of humans make the same mistakes, seeing the same patterns of corruption and decay repeat themselves endlessly, Harkin began to wonder whether Adyr might have been right. After all, the civilizations that emerged in the wake of the judge's fall were not necessarily better than what had come before. They were different, but they faced many of the same fundamental problems. Crime still existed, inequality persisted, and the powerful still found ways to exploit the weak. Perhaps most troubling of all, new forms of the Rogur blight began to appear as the centuries passed. The corruption that had originally been associated with Adyr's influence seemed to be an inherent part of the world itself, manifesting in different forms, but never truly eliminated. This led Harkin to a disturbing conclusion: that the corruption he had fought against was not external to humanity, but internal to it. The judges had not been corrupted by Adyr's influence alone, but by their own nature, as beings capable of both great good and great evil. The realization that evil might be an inherent part of the human condition, rather than an external force to be defeated, was profoundly demoralizing. It suggested that all of his sacrifices had been in vain, that the victory he had achieved was temporary at best. Yet Harkin also witnessed moments of genuine heroism and selfless sacrifice during his long exile. Individual humans continued to choose good over evil, often at great personal cost. These moments did not change the overall pattern of history, but they provided small glimmers of hope in an otherwise dark landscape. It was during this period that Harkin began to understand the true nature of the choice he had made when he refused to use the rune of Adyr to restore the demon god's power. He had not chosen good over evil in any absolute sense, but had chosen uncertainty over certainty, potential over security. This choice had preserved humanity's ability to continue struggling with its fundamental problems, rather than having those problems solved through divine intervention. It was not a solution, but a commitment to the ongoing process of trying to be better. The knowledge that the struggle would never end, that each generation would have to face the same fundamental challenges and make the same difficult choices was both overwhelming and strangely comforting. It meant that the fight for human dignity and freedom was not a battle to be won, but a way of life to be embraced. As the first millennium of his exile drew to a close, Harkin began to sense changes in the world that suggested new crises were approaching. The beacons that contained Adyr's power were showing signs of corruption once again, and there were reports of strange phenomena in various parts of the world. The cyclical nature of history was asserting itself once more. Just as Adyr had returned after 8,000 years of imprisonment, so too were the forces of corruption and tyranny reasserting themselves in new forms. The eternal struggle was about to enter a new phase. But this time, Harkin would not be the one to lead humanity's resistance. His time as an active hero had passed, and his role now was different. To serve as a witness to history, a keeper of knowledge, and perhaps a guide for a new generation of heroes who would face their own impossible choices. Chapter 10. The Rise of the Sentinels. In the centuries following Harkin's exile, humanity once again organized itself around the need to prevent divine tyranny. The 5 beacons of Sentinels, those magnificent towers that had originally contained Adyr's power, became the focal point of a new religious and military order dedicated to ensuring that the demon god would never again threaten the mortal realm. The Hallowed Sentinels, as this order came to be known, were founded by Judge Cleric, who was originally known as Eel. As one of the original chainers who had bound Adyr, she was one of the few who possessed both the knowledge and the power necessary to maintain the magical barriers containing the demon god. Her transformation from Adyr's former warrior priestess to one of his greatest enemies made her uniquely qualified to understand the threat he represented. The establishment of the Sentinels represented a new approach to the eternal problem of maintaining order without falling into tyranny. Rather than trying to create a perfect society, the Sentinels focused on the more limited, but perhaps more achievable goal of preventing the return of absolute evil. The 5 beacons became both symbols and instruments of this mission. Each tower was a marvel of magical engineering, designed not just to contain Adyr's power, but to serve as a focal point for humanity's collective resistance to divine tyranny. They were beacons in the truest sense, sources of light in the darkness, reminding us that even the mightiest gods could be defeated by united human effort. The land of Mournstead, where these beacons were located, became a sacred territory dedicated to this eternal vigil. Here, the most dedicated and capable warriors from across the human realm came to train and serve, knowing that they were part of something larger than themselves. But as the centuries passed, the same patterns that had affected previous human institutions began to assert themselves within the Sentinel. Order, the noble mission of protecting humanity, gradually became corrupted by the very human. Desires for power, status, and control that had undermined every previous attempt at creating a just society. The corruption of the Sentinels was particularly tragic because it represented the failure of humanity's most conscious attempt to learn from its past mistakes. The founders of the Order had been aware of the problems that had destroyed the Judge's society, and they had tried to create safeguards against those same problems. Yet despite their best efforts, the Sentinels gradually transformed from protectors into oppressors. The power they wielded in the name of protecting humanity from divine tyranny became a form of tyranny itself. The warriors who had been trained to resist corruption became corrupted themselves. This transformation was gradual and subtle, making it all the more insidious. Each compromise with principle was justified by necessity. Each expansion of power was defended as essential for the mission of protection. The Sentinels did not suddenly become evil. They slowly and almost imperceptibly became the very thing they had been created to oppose. The corruption manifested in different ways throughout the Order. Some Sentinels became obsessed with maintaining order to the point where they could not tolerate any form of dissent or independent thinking. Others developed an elitist attitude that viewed ordinary humans as too weak or stupid to govern themselves. Perhaps most dangerous of all were those Sentinels who began to believe that they understood the true nature of divine power better than anyone else. These individuals started to see themselves not as servants of humanity, but as its rightful rulers, justified in their authority by their superior understanding of cosmic forces. The beacons themselves began to reflect this corruption. The pure light that had once emanated from these towers became tainted, taking on colors and qualities that suggested the very evil they were meant to contain was seeping through their defenses. This corruption was not just symbolic, but literal. The magical energies that powered the beacons were being influenced by the moral corruption of those who maintained them. The towers were becoming conduits not just for containing evil, but for channeling it into the world in new and subtle forms. Judge Cleric herself, despite her original noble intentions and her crucial role in Adyr's defeat, gradually succumbed to the same corruption that had claimed the other judges centuries earlier. The burden of maintaining eternal vigilance against divine tyranny, combined with the corrupting influence of the rune of Adyr that Harkin would eventually entrust to her, had worn down her moral resistance, leaving her vulnerable to the very influences she had spent her life fighting. This corruption was particularly tragic because Isal had originally been a warrior priestess of Adyr before betraying him to serve Aureus. Her fall represented not just personal failure, but the cyclical nature of corruption that seemed to affect all who wielded divine power, regardless of their original intentions or moral strength. The irony was that in their efforts to prevent the return of Adyr, the Sentinels had created conditions that made such a return more likely. Their tyrannical behavior had alienated much of the population they were supposed to protect, while their corruption had weakened the very magical defenses they were meant to maintain. As the first millennium after Harkin's victory drew to a close, the signs of impending crisis became impossible to ignore. The beacons flickered and dimmed, their corruption becoming visible to even casual observers. Strange creatures began to appear in remote areas, suggesting that the barriers between dimensions were once again breaking down. Most ominously, there were reports of a mysterious figure known only as the Iron Wayfarer, a traveler whose very presence seemed to herald disaster. This figure moved through the land like a harbinger of doom, leaving chaos and destruction in his wake. Few recognized the Iron Wayfarer for who he truly was. Harkin himself returned after centuries of exile to deal with a crisis that his original victory had merely postponed rather than solved. The hero who had once saved humanity from divine tyranny was now forced to confront the fact that his sacrifice had ultimately been in vain. The stage was set for a new chapter in the eternal struggle between order and chaos, freedom and tyranny, hope and despair. But this time, the lines between hero and villain, between savior and destroyer, would be even more blurred than before. Chapter 11. The Iron Wayfarer returns. The figure who walked the roads of Mournstead in the dying days of the Sentinel Order bore little resemblance to the man who had once saved humanity from divine tyranny. Centuries of exile had changed Harkin in ways that went far beyond the physical, transforming him from a hopeful, if reluctant hero into something far more complex and morally ambiguous. The name Iron Wayfarer was both disguise and accurate description. The iron represented the hardness that had grown within him over the centuries, the emotional armor he had developed to survive the endless cycle of human folly and corruption. The Wayfarer aspect reflected his eternal journey, never able to find rest or peace in a world that had rejected his sacrifice. Harkin returned to active involvement in world affairs was not motivated by heroism in any traditional sense. He had not come back to save humanity again, but to deal with a problem that his previous actions had created. The rune of Adyr that he carried had become a burden too heavy to bear alone, and the corruption it represented was beginning to affect even his immortal constitution. The centuries of carrying this artifact had taken their toll. The demon god's influence had not corrupted Harkin in the same way it had corrupted others, but it had changed him nonetheless. He had gained insights into the nature of power and corruption that few mortals could comprehend. But this knowledge had come at the cost of his faith in humanity's potential for redemption. When Harkin finally approached Judge Cleric with an offer to transfer custody of the rune of Adyr, he was not acting out of trust, but out of desperation. He recognized that he could no longer safely contain the artifact's power, and he hoped that the leader of the Sentinels might have developed better methods for dealing with such dangerous forces. This decision would prove to be one of the greatest mistakes in human history, though it was made with the best of intentions. Harkin's trust in Judge Cleric was based on his memory of her, as she had been centuries earlier, not as she had become through years of corruption and moral compromise. Judge Cleric, now known by her original name, Esau, had indeed developed methods for dealing with divine power, but not in the way that Harkin had hoped. Rather than finding ways to contain such forces, she had learned to harness them for her own purposes. The rune of Adyr represented not a dangerous burden to be contained, but an opportunity to be exploited. The transfer of the rune to Judge Cleric was the catalyst that Adyr had been waiting for through long centuries of imprisonment. The demon god's power had been growing stronger over time, fed by the corruption that had infected every human institution that had tried to contain it. Now, with the rune in the hands of someone who was already partially corrupted, he could begin to exert direct influence once again. The corruption of Judge Cleric was particularly tragic because she represented humanity's last hope for maintaining the barriers that contained Adyr's power. As the leader of the Sentinels, she was the guardian of the 5 beacons, the magical towers that kept the demon god imprisoned. Her fall meant that these defenses would inevitably fail. But Judge Cleric's corruption was also particularly dangerous because it was not immediately obvious. Unlike the gross transformations that had marked the corruption of previous leaders, her fall was subtle and hidden. She maintained the appearance of righteousness while secretly serving the very evil she was supposed to oppose. This hidden corruption allowed Adyr to work through her, to systematically weaken the magical defenses that CONTA ... truncated 285 characters, would be noticed and resisted. Instead, he worked through small compromises and incremental shifts in policy, each one justified by practical necessity or noble intentions. The other Sentinels, despite their own corruption, initially failed to recognize what was happening to their leader. They were too caught up in their own moral blind spots to see the larger pattern of decay that was affecting their entire organization. By the time the signs of Judge Cleric's corruption became undeniable, it was too late to stop the process she had set in motion. The beacons were failing, their light growing dim and tainted. Strange creatures were appearing throughout Mournstead, and dimensional barriers were beginning to break down. Harkin, meanwhile, had to live with the knowledge that his attempt to rid himself of the rune of Adyr had made the situation worse rather than better. His decision to trust Judge Cleric, made in a moment of desperate hope, had inadvertently handed victory to the very enemy he had spent his life fighting. The realization that he had been manipulated, that his own actions had contributed to the crisis now facing humanity, was almost unbearable. For someone who had already endured centuries of guilt and isolation, this new burden of responsibility threatened to destroy what remained of his sanity. Yet, even in his despair, Harkin retained enough of his original heroic nature to recognize that the situation demanded action. He could not undo his mistake, but he could try to limit its consequences. If Adyr was going to return, then someone would have to be there to oppose him. But this time, Harkin would not be fighting alone. The crisis that was engulfing Mournstead had produced a new generation of heroes. Warriors who called themselves Dark Crusaders and who possessed capabilities that even Harkin found impressive. Chapter 12. The Dark Crusaders. In the darkest hour of humanity's struggle against divine tyranny, when the Sentinels had been corrupted and Adyr's return seemed inevitable, a new order of warriors emerged from the shadows. The Dark Crusaders represented something entirely new in the long history of humanity's resistance to oppression. Heroes who embraced the darkness in order to fight it. Unlike previous champions who had sought to embody pure virtue and righteousness, the Dark Crusaders understood that fighting monsters sometimes required becoming monstrous oneself. They did not seek to remain untainted by the evil they fought, but rather to turn that darkness against itself. This philosophy was born from hard experience and bitter wisdom. The cycles of corruption that had destroyed the judges and the Sentinels had taught humanity a crucial lesson: that those who claimed moral purity were often the most vulnerable to corruption, while those who acknowledged their own capacity for evil were better equipped to resist it. The Dark Crusaders were not recruited from the ranks of the righteous and pure, but from those who had already been touched by darkness and had found ways to resist its influence. They were warriors who had stared into the abyss and emerged with their essential humanity intact, if scarred. This approach to heroism was controversial, even among those who recognized its effectiveness. Critics argued that the Dark Crusaders were too willing to compromise their principles, that their methods made them indistinguishable from the enemies they fought. Supporters countered that in a world where traditional virtue had repeatedly failed, pragmatic adaptability was the only viable approach. The organization of the Dark Crusaders was deliberately decentralized and informal, designed to avoid the institutional corruption that had destroyed previous orders. Rather than creating a hierarchy that could be corrupted from the top down, they operated as a loose confederation of autonomous individuals united by shared purpose rather than formal structure. Each Dark Crusader was expected to make their own moral choices and live with the consequences. There were no absolute rules or rigid codes of conduct, only general principles and the understanding that each situation required individual judgment. This approach was messy and sometimes led to conflicts within the order, but it also made the organization more resilient to corruption. The Dark Crusaders' most distinctive capability was their mastery of the umbral lamp, a mysterious artifact that granted its bearer the ability to traverse between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead. This power was both practically useful and symbolically appropriate, as it represented the Dark Crusaders' willingness to walk the line between light and darkness. The umbral lamp was not just a tool, but a test of character. Its power could easily corrupt those who used it, tempting them with abilities that bordered on the divine. Only those who had already proven their resistance to such temptations could safely wield it without losing themselves to its influence. The ability to travel between realms gave the Dark Crusaders unprecedented tactical advantages in their fight against Adyr's forces. They could approach problems from multiple dimensions, literally and figuratively, finding solutions that would be impossible for those limited to a single plane of existence. But this power also came with profound psychological costs. Constant exposure to the realm of the dead, with its twisted landscapes and tormented inhabitants, took a toll on even the strongest minds. Many Dark Crusaders suffered from nightmares, hallucinations, and other forms of mental trauma as a result of their service. The recruitment and training of new Dark Crusaders was necessarily limited and selective. Not everyone had the psychological resilience required to wield the umbral lamp safely, and those who failed the test often paid with their sanity or their lives. This selectivity meant that the Dark Crusaders would always be a small force, outnumbered by their enemies and operating on the margins of society. They could not hope to defeat Adyr through sheer numbers or conventional military tactics. Instead, they had to rely on superior skill, intimate knowledge of their enemy, and willingness to take risks that others would not dare. The Dark Crusaders also possessed something that previous orders had lacked: institutional memory of failure. They studied the histories of the judges and the Sentinels not as inspiring examples to follow, but as cautionary tales to avoid. This knowledge of past mistakes made them more resistant to the patterns of corruption that had destroyed their predecessors. Yet even the Dark Crusaders were not immune to the fundamental problems that affected all human institutions. The same psychological and social forces that had corrupted previous orders were still present, still working to undermine their mission. The difference was that the Dark Crusaders were aware of these forces and had developed strategies for resisting them. As Adyr's return became imminent and the beacons began to fail, the Dark Crusaders found themselves facing the greatest test of their philosophy and capabilities. They would have to prove that their unconventional approach to heroism was not just theoretically sound, but practically effective against the ultimate enemy. The stakes could not have been higher. If the Dark Crusaders failed, there would likely be no fourth chance for humanity. The cycles of corruption and renewal that had characterized previous ages could not continue indefinitely. Eventually, the forces of chaos and tyranny would achieve a permanent victory. But if they succeeded, they would not just defeat Adyr once again, but potentially break the cycle of corruption that had plagued humanity for millennia. Their approach to heroism, if proven effective, could provide a template for future generations to follow. Chapter 13. The Bearer of the Lamp. Among the Dark Crusaders, one individual would emerge to play a role analogous to that of the original three judges or Harkin in previous ages. This figure, known simply as the Bearer, possessed capabilities that went beyond even the considerable powers of their fellow Dark Crusaders. The Bearer was not chosen through any formal process or divine revelation, but emerged organically from the ranks of the Dark Crusaders through a combination of skill, determination, and sheer survival instinct. In the chaotic conditions that prevailed as Adyr's return approached, leadership often fell to those who were simply too stubborn to give up and too capable to ignore. What distinguished the Bearer from other Dark Crusaders was not just their mastery of the umbral, but their ability to survive the psychological toll of constant exposure to the realm of the dead. Where others might succumb to madness or despair, the Bearer maintained their essential humanity, while gaining insights into the nature of existence that few mortals could comprehend. This psychological resilience was crucial because the Bearer's mission would require them to make decisions that would affect not just their own fate, but the destiny of all humanity. The weight of such responsibility had broken stronger individuals in the past, but the Bearer somehow found the inner strength to carry this burden. The Bearer's journey through the corrupted landscape of Mournstead was both a physical quest and a spiritual odyssey. Each location they visited, each enemy they defeated, each choice they made contributed to their understanding of the fundamental forces at work in their world. Unlike previous heroes who had operated with relatively clear moral guidelines, the Bearer was forced to navigate a landscape where the traditional distinctions between good and evil had been thoroughly blurred. The Sentinels who were supposed to be protecting humanity had become its oppressors. The beacons that were meant to contain evil had become sources of corruption. Even the realm of the dead, traditionally seen as a place of rest for departed souls, had become a battlefield. In this morally ambiguous environment, the Bearer could not rely on simple rules or absolute principles to guide their actions. Instead, they had to develop a more nuanced understanding of ethics that could accommodate the complex realities of their situation. This moral flexibility was both a strength and a potential weakness. It allowed the Bearer to find solutions to problems that would have stymied more rigid thinkers. But it also created the risk that they might lose sight of what they were ultimately fighting for. The Bearer's ability to traverse between the realms of the living and the dead gave them a unique perspective on the nature of existence itself. They could see how actions in one realm affected the other, how the choices of the living shaped the fate of the dead, and vice versa. This perspective was crucial for understanding Adyr's true nature and the source of his power. The demon god was not simply a creature of evil, but a force that transcended the normal boundaries between life and death, order and chaos, good and evil. Defeating him would require someone who could operate on the same cosmic level. The bearer's growing mastery of the umbral lamp also brought them into contact with entities and forces that existed beyond the normal scope of human experience. Some of these beings were helpful, offering guidance or assistance in the struggle against Adyr. Others were hostile or indifferent, viewing the conflict between humanity and the demon god as irrelevant to their own cosmic concerns. These encounters forced the bearer to grapple with questions about humanity's place in a larger universe, populated by beings of immense power and alien motivations. Was humanity worth saving if it was ultimately insignificant in cosmic terms? Did the struggle against tyranny matter if it was just one small part of an incomprehensibly vast reality? The bearer's answers to these questions would shape not just their own actions, but the eventual outcome of the conflict with Adyr. Their choices would determine whether humanity's resistance to divine tyranny was motivated by cosmic significance or merely by stubborn refusal to surrender. As the bearer's power and understanding grew, they began to attract the attention of other cosmic forces beyond Adyr himself. Some of these entities saw the bearer as a potential ally or tool to be used for their own purposes. Others viewed them as a threat to be eliminated before they could become too powerful. This cosmic attention added another layer of complexity to the bearer's mission. They were not just fighting against Adyr, but potentially becoming embroiled in conflicts between forces that operated on scales beyond human comprehension. The pressure of these cosmic forces, combined with the weight of human expectations and the psychological toll of wielding the umbral lamp, created a situation where the bearer was constantly at risk of losing their humanity. The very qualities that made them effective against Adyr also made them vulnerable to becoming something inhuman themselves. The question of whether the bearer could retain their essential humanity while gaining the power necessary to defeat a god became central to their story. This was not just a practical concern, but a philosophical one. It went to the heart of what it meant to be human in a universe populated by beings of godlike power. Chapter 14. The Cleansing of the Beacons. The 5 beacons of Sentinels stood as monuments to humanity's determination to never again bow before divine tyranny. For over 1,000 years, these magnificent towers had contained Adyr's power, their pure light serving as both prison and warning. Now, as corruption seeped through their defenses and the demon god's influence grew stronger, the bearer faced the most crucial decision of their quest: whether to cleanse these beacons or destroy them entirely. Each beacon represented not just a magical construct, but a philosophical position about the nature of divine power and humanity's relationship to it. The decision of how to deal with them would determine not just the immediate outcome of the conflict with Adyr, but the future direction of human civilization. The first beacon that the bearer encountered was already showing signs of severe corruption. The pure light that had once emanated from its peak was now tainted with sickly colors that hurt to look upon directly. The very air around the tower was thick with malevolent energy that seemed to whisper of despair and surrender. The corruption was not merely cosmetic, but functional. The beacon was no longer serving its intended purpose of containing Adyr's power. Instead, it had become a conduit through which the demon god could influence the mortal realm. Each day that passed saw the corruption spread further, affecting the landscape and inhabitants of the surrounding area. The bearer's approach to this first beacon would establish the pattern for how they dealt with the others. They could attempt to cleanse the corruption, restoring the beacon to its original function. They could destroy the beacon entirely, eliminating its corrupted influence, but also removing one of the barriers that contained Adyr, or they could leave it as it was, avoiding immediate consequences, but allowing the corruption to continue spreading. The choice was complicated by the fact that each option carried both immediate and long-term consequences that were difficult to predict. Cleansing the beacon might temporarily restore its function, but what guarantee was there that it would not become corrupted again? Destroying it might eliminate a source of corruption, but it would also weaken the overall containment system. The bearer's investigation of the beacon revealed the extent to which the corruption had penetrated the Sentinel Order. The Guardians, who were supposed to maintain the tower, had themselves become agents of the very evil they were meant to oppose. They fought with desperate fury, but their resistance was motivated not by noble purpose, but by corrupted instinct. Defeating these corrupted sentinels was both a practical necessity and a symbolic act. Each victory represented not just the elimination of an immediate threat, but the breaking of another link in the chain of corruption that bound humanity to its oppressors. The process of cleansing a beacon, when the bearer chose that option, was both physically and spiritually demanding. It required not just the application of raw power through the umbral lamp, but a deep understanding of the magical principles that had originally created the towers. More importantly, cleansing required the bearer to confront the corruption directly, to expose themselves to the same influences that had destroyed so many others. This was perhaps the greatest test of their psychological resilience and moral strength. The cleansed beacons did not simply return to their original state, but were transformed by the bearer's influence. The light that now emanated from them was different from what had come before. Neither the pure white of the original construction, nor the sickly colors of corruption, but something new that reflected the bearer's own complex nature. This transformation worried some observers, who wondered whether the bearer was merely replacing one form of divine influence with another. The line between savior and conqueror had been blurred so many times in the past that any concentration of power, no matter how well-intentioned, was cause for concern. But others argued that this transformation was exactly what humanity needed. Divine power that was neither purely good nor purely evil, but complex and nuanced like humanity itself. The bearer's influence on the beacons might represent a new form of divine guidance that could avoid the extremes that had characterized previous ages. As the bearer moved from beacon to beacon, the challenges they faced became increasingly difficult. The corruption was not randomly distributed, but had been carefully orchestrated by Adyr's influence. Each tower presented a specific test designed to exploit particular weaknesses or force particular compromises. The fourth beacon was guarded by Judge Cleric herself, now revealed in her full corruption as Essel, the former priestess of Adyr, who had betrayed her god only to be consumed by guilt, and eventually corrupted by his lingering influence. This confrontation was not just a battle between opponents, but a tragic encounter between two individuals who had both sacrificed everything in their struggle against divine tyranny. Essel's corruption was particularly heartbreaking because it was rooted in genuine remorse and self-doubt. Her betrayal of Adyr had been motivated by genuine conviction that his rule was evil, but centuries of guilt had made her vulnerable to his renewed influence. She fought not out of loyalty to the demon god, but out of a desperate desire for forgiveness that she believed only he could provide. The battle with Essel forced the bearer to confront questions about the nature of redemption and the possibility of forgiveness. Could someone who had fallen so far ever truly be saved? Was corruption always permanent? Or was there hope, even for those who had seemed utterly lost? The bearer's victory over Essel was bittersweet. It eliminated a major obstacle to their mission, but it also represented the final destruction of one of the few remaining links to the heroic age that had originally defeated Adyr. With Essel's death, the last of the original champions was gone, leaving only their corrupted legacy. The fifth and final beacon presented the ultimate test. located in the heart of the Sentinel stronghold. It was the most powerful and the most thoroughly corrupted of all the towers. Its corruption had spread so far that it had transformed the entire surrounding area into a nightmarish landscape where the boundaries between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead had begun to break down. The bearer's decision regarding this final beacon would determine not just their own fate, but the nature of the final confrontation with the cosmic forces at work in their world. The choices available would reflect three fundamentally different approaches to dealing with divine power and its corruption. Chapter 15. The Three Paths to Resolution. As the bearer stood before the final beacon, they found themselves at the culmination of a journey that had transformed them from a simple warrior into something approaching a cosmic force in their own right. According to the established lore, their accumulated power and knowledge had prepared them for this moment. But they had also created three distinct paths toward resolving the crisis. The first path was that of radiance, the choice to cleanse the beacons and align with Aureus and his followers. This represented the path that most closely aligned with traditional heroic narratives, where the corruption of Adyr would be purged and divine order restored under Aureus' guidance. Choosing the path of radiance would require the bearer to storm Bramus Castle, the fortress where Adyr had established his stronghold, and confront the demon god directly in the Rogue realm. This was exactly the kind of direct confrontation that heroes were supposed to seek. A clear battle between the forces of light and darkness, with the fate of the world hanging in the balance. But the path of radiance also carried significant costs and risks. While it would eliminate Adyr as a threat, it would also result in Aureus taking control. And the established lore suggests that this victory comes with its own form of divine judgment. The bearer would sacrifice their own life in the process, and Aureus would proceed to rain down beams of radiance to purge all whom he deemed sinners, which appears to be nearly everyone. The second path was that of Inferno, the choice to side with Adyr rather than Aureus. This path required the bearer to obtain the rune of Adyr and use it to break the beacons rather than cleanse them, ultimately freeing the demon god and allowing him to possess Judge Cleric Isal as his vessel for returning to the world. The path of Inferno required the bearer to obtain the rune of Adyr and use it to break the beacons rather than cleanse them. This would free the demon god from his prison, but it would also provide an opportunity to negotiate with him from a position of relative strength. Adyr, as the bearer would discover, was not interested in simple conquest, but in proving his philosophical point about the necessity of divine rule. If the bearer could demonstrate their worthiness and align themselves with his goals, they could potentially become partners in ruling the world rather than opponents in destroying it. This path offered the promise of Adyr's rule returning to the world with the bearer, elevated to the status of Rogue Lord in recognition of their service. According to the lore, this ending sees Adyr leading a bloody crusade against all who would oppose him, suggesting that while the bearer survives, the cost is paid by the rest of humanity. The third path was that of Umbral, the choice to reject both Aureus and Adyr in favor of serving the Putrid Mother, an eldritch entity that sought to merge the realms of Axiom and Umbral permanently. This path required the bearer to make the ultimate sacrifice, allowing the Putrid Mother to use their essence to weaken the veil between worlds and consume all of existence. The path of Umbral required the bearer to seek out Molu, the dark priest who had originally created the Umbral lamp, and gain access to Mother's Law, a strange realm that existed outside the normal boundaries of reality. This journey would require the bearer to sacrifice several important allies, demonstrating their commitment to transformation regardless of the personal cost. In Mother's Law, the bearer would encounter the Putrid Mother, an eldritch entity that represented a completely different approach to cosmic power. Unlike Adyr or Aureus, who sought to impose order or chaos upon reality, The putrid mother simply sought to consume all of existence, returning it to the primordial state from which it had originally emerged. The path of Umbral offered the ultimate solution to the problem of divine tyranny, the elimination of all gods, all order, and ultimately all existence itself. It was a form of cosmic suicide that would spare future generations from having to face the same impossible choices that had plagued humanity for millennia. But this path also represented the ultimate defeat of everything that humanity had struggled to achieve. All of the art, culture, love, and beauty that humans had created would be destroyed, along with all of the corruption and evil. It was a solution that solved the problem by eliminating everyone who might be affected by it. Each of these three paths reflected different philosophical approaches to the fundamental questions raised by the story. Though it's important to note that much of the deeper philosophical interpretation comes from thematic analysis rather than explicit exposition in the games. The Path of Radiance can be seen as representing faith in traditional order despite its costs. The Path of Inferno represents pragmatic acceptance of necessary but harsh leadership. The Path of Umbral represents the ultimate rejection of existence itself as a solution to the problem of suffering. The bearer's choice between these paths would determine not just the immediate outcome of the crisis, but would establish the canonical direction for any future stories in this universe. Chapter 16. The Confrontation with Divinity. Regardless of which path the bearer chose, your journey would ultimately lead to a direct confrontation with forces that operated on a cosmic scale far beyond normal human comprehension. According to the established lore, these encounters would test not just their combat abilities, but their resolve and convictions. If the bearer chose the Path of Radiance, their confrontation with Adyr in the Rogur realm would reveal the demon god not as a simple embodiment of evil, but as an entity whose motivations included genuine arguments about cosmic order. The established dialogue shows Adyr attempting to convince the bearer that humanity needs divine guidance, presenting evidence of human corruption and failure. According to the game's lore, the bearer's victory in this confrontation comes through using the Umbral Lamp to absorb Adyr's essence, which destroys the demon god, but also kills the bearer in the process. The ending shows Aureus taking control and proceeding to judge and purge those he deems sinners with beams of radiant light. This victory demonstrates that defeating one form of divine tyranny may simply replace it with another. As Aureus' purification appears to affect nearly everyone in the world, if the bearer chose the Path of Inferno, their confrontation would take a very different form. Rather than opposing Adyr, they would seek to ally with him, offering their own perspective and wisdom as a moderating influence on his rule. This path would require the bearer to enter Isol's dream state and allow Adyr to possess her body, providing the demon god with a vessel for returning to the mortal realm. The bearer would become a Rogur lord, granted immense power, but also bound to serve Adyr's vision of cosmic order. The confrontation in this scenario would be internal rather than external, as the bearer struggled to maintain their individual identity and moral convictions while being integrated into a divine hierarchy. They would have to prove that they could wield godlike power without being corrupted by it. Success on this path would mean becoming a bridge between divine and mortal perspectives, helping to create a form of rule that combined the stability of divine authority with the compassion and understanding that came from human experience. If the bearer chose the Path of Umbral, their confrontations would be with entities that existed entirely outside normal moral categories. The putrid mother was not evil in any conventional sense, but rather represented a completely alien perspective on the nature of existence itself. The journey to reach the putrid mother would require the bearer to sacrifice allies like Damaros, Gerlind, and Molhu, using seed pods that would consume their essence to power the bearer's transformation. These sacrifices were not motivated by malice or pragmatic necessity, but by the cosmic logic of the Umbral. The final confrontation with the putrid mother would be less a battle than a merger, as the eldritch entity absorbed the bearer's essence and used it to begin the process of consuming all of reality. This was not victory in any traditional sense, but rather the ultimate act of cosmic rebellion against the very concept of existence. Each of these confrontations would reveal different aspects of the cosmic forces that shaped reality in the world of Lords of the Fallen. They demonstrated that the conflict between order and chaos, freedom and tyranny, was not limited to the human realm, but extended to the fundamental structure of existence itself. The bearer's choice of how to engage with these cosmic forces would determine not just their own fate, but the nature of reality itself for all future generations. They were not just choosing between different political systems or moral philosophies, but between different visions of what existence should be. Chapter 17. The Ancient Labyrinth. During Harkin's original journey through the Rogur realm, he had encountered the Crafter and learned of mysteries that extended beyond the immediate crisis of Adyr's return. One of these mysteries was the Ancient Labyrinth, a long-forgotten library that had been locked away between the human and demonic realms for millennia. The Crafter's discovery of this hidden dimension presented Harkin with an opportunity to delve deeper into the cosmic forces that shaped his world. The Ancient Labyrinth was not just a repository of knowledge, but a testing ground where the fundamental nature of reality could be explored and understood. The labyrinth itself was a marvel of magical engineering, consisting of 3 rotating circles that could be manipulated through control, levers to create different pathways through the maze. This was not merely a physical puzzle, but a metaphysical one that required understanding of cosmic principles to navigate successfully. The rotating nature of the labyrinth reflected the cyclical patterns that characterized the broader narrative of Lords of the Fallen. Just as history repeated itself in cycles of corruption and renewal, order and chaos, the labyrinth structure embodied the idea that all paths eventually led back to their starting point. Within the maze, Harkin encountered the mysterious stranger, an entity whose true nature remained deliberately obscure. This figure served as both guide and test, challenging Harkin to prove his worthiness while offering cryptic advice about the nature of the forces he was confronting. The creatures that inhabited the labyrinth were not ordinary demons or monsters, but manifestations of cosmic principles given physical form. Fighting them was not just a matter of martial skill, but of understanding the underlying forces they represented and finding ways to overcome or transcend them. The ghostly skeletons that patrolled the maze were particularly significant, as they represented the lingering influence of those who had sought knowledge in this place before. Their presence served as a warning that the pursuit of cosmic understanding came with inherent dangers that could destroy those unprepared for such revelations. At the heart of the labyrinth waited the Keeper, an ancient entity that had absorbed centuries of knowledge and power from those who had challenged it. This was not merely a guardian to be defeated, but a repository of cosmic wisdom that could only be accessed by proving one's worthiness through combat. The Keeper's ability to change its magical schools during battle reflected the fluid nature of cosmic forces.